Jamaican who's lived in Britain since he was 8 is threatened with deportation despite having been here for over half a century. A 60-year-old painter and decorator who has lived in Britain since arriving from Jamaica as an 8-year-old boy has been threatened with deportation in the latest instance of heavy-handed treatment by the Home Office. Anthony Bryan, who lives in North London, arrived in Britain when he was 8 and has lived in the country ever since, going to primary and secondary schools in the capital, working and paying taxes as a painter and decorator and helping to bring up his children and 7 grandchildren. Despite that, he was sent to an immigration detention center earlier this month and booked by Home Office staff on a flight back to Jamaica, which he hasn't returned to since leaving 52 years ago. A last-minute intervention by an immigration lawyer meant his place on the plane was cancelled and he was released from the detention center last week. However, his situation remains uncertain and he's been left dumbfounded by his treatment by the Home Office, which has left him feeling depressed. Speaking to The Guardian, he said, "I feel they could have treated me better than this after I've been here 52 years. Mr. Bryan's local MP Kate Ossamer described his situation as barbaric. She said, "People are left wondering, how can someone who has done so much for the community be treated like a piece of rubbish? Why send people to detention when they have done nothing wrong?" Government guidelines state that anyone who settled in the UK by January 1, 1973, the UK entered the European Economic Community, has the right to remain in the country. However, Mr. Bryan has struggled to find sufficient documents to prove he arrived in Britain before then. He was so young when he arrived in Britain he travelled on his older brother's passport, as both his primary and secondary schools either destroyed records or only keeps them for the last 20 years. During the last 40 years he's worked as a painter and decorator and has national insurance records to show he was in regular employment. He was made to stop work in 2015 when he applied for a passport and the Home Office's immigration enforcement contractor, Capita, told him he had no right to remain in Britain. He was later taken to an immigration detention center and then held Campsfield Detention Center this month, after an appeal was rejected. Mr. Bryan was only allowed to remain in the country he calls home thanks to the help of an immigration lawyer, but he is now living in fear of what the future holds. The Home Office said Bryan was not currently subject to removal action, adding that he had failed so far to provide the necessary evidence to show a lawful right to remain here. Mr. Bryan's case is the latest in a series of Britons who have been threatened with deportation despite living here for the best part of half a century. Earlier this month, Paulette Wilson, 61, who lives in Wolverhampton, was almost booted out the country despite living in the UK for nearly 50 years. However, she is still waiting to be legally recognized by the government. Ms. Wilson was looked after by her grandparents when she arrived in Britain in 1968. She attended primary and secondary school here and has 34 years of national insurance payments. She also has a British daughter and grandchild. During that time she has never returned to Jamaica. However, she received a letter saying she had no right to in the country and was then detained and taken to the Yarl's Wood Immigration Removal Center. Although she was released after an intervention from the Refugee and Migrant Center in Wolverhampton, she has to report again to the Home Office this month and still faces the prospect of deportation. She has lost her benefits for the past 2 years and also lost her flat. She is now dependent on the financial support of her daughter Natalie Barnes, who works part-time as a school lunchtime supervisor. In a statement, the Home Office said there had been ongoing discussions with Ms. Wilson over the past 3 years about how she could regularize her immigration status, including contact with her EP. These discussions did not lead to her making an application or providing the necessary evidence to show a lawful right to remain. However, Ms. Wilson has now submitted an application last month and we are looking into her case to help regularize her immigration status. In a similar case, last week former boxer Johnny Nelson sent a tweet to the Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, saying, "My 68-year-old brother has been in the UK for 53 years. He has received a letter stating he has 10 days to leave or appeal. He received indefinite stay on his passport, lost in a house fire over 20 years ago. He's in OAP and will have to find hundreds of pounds for legal representation. After his tweet was met with a huge response, Nelson later explained that the situation was currently being dealt with correctly and swiftly.